Hey everyone, welcome to Lambda School's Introduction to Web Development course. My name is Deandra Ryan Moss and I will be your instructor for the next 2 weeks. So before we get started with tonight's lecture, I wanted to open things up with a question to all of you guys. So feel free to put your answers in the chat, in the little chat window inside of Zoom. So my question for you is, what makes someone a software engineer? What does it mean for someone to be a software engineer? So feel free to throw any ideas you guys have out there. And the reason I'm posing this question is because I think it's the absolute most important goal of these 2 weeks. So you might be thinking about these 2 weeks as being a stepping stone to getting into Lambda School or a process for learning some basics of web development, and those are all going to happen. But I think that our most important objective of this whole thing is to really make sure you guys have a good idea about what that is. Because if that's somewhere you are considering taking your career, I think that understanding what it means to be a software engineer is pretty important. All right, so I'm getting lots of answers, so I'm gonna kind of grab a few samplings of what you guys are throwing out there and share with everyone. We have, someone who makes programs, someone who builds projects to solve programs, creatively solving problems through code, anyone who writes code, finding solutions with code, etc., etc. Ooh, I like this one. Have the ability to think creatively and solve problems efficiently. So a lot of you guys are throwing out really practical, hands-on answers, things about actually building things with code or writing code. But there's also kind of this emphasis that a few people have thrown out about a need for creativity, and a need for problem solving. So really great answers, you guys. And we are going to come back to this question a few more times throughout the lecture, and then I'll kind of give you my answer at the end. So anyways, hope that got your guys' brains moving. There'll be lots of need for brain moving throughout this whole course. So anyways, so I want to go ahead and introduce myself a little bit and talk a little bit about Lambda School and about this class, and then we'll jump into more coding related stuff. So I'll start by just introducing myself in a little more detail. So as I said, my name is Deandra. My first exposure to computer programming, which was web design exposure, was at the age of 14 when back in the MySpace era, I was determined to figure out how to make my MySpace page look as cool as possible. So I started digging into the code behind it and tinkering with it and playing with it. And I developed an interest in computer programming. It kind of lay mostly dormant. I studied math in college, so I got some exposure to programming there. I ended up doing a research project where I got to write code to solve complex calculus problems. That was fun. But I really didn't get into programming in a serious way until after college, when I actually attended an immersive myself in Austin, Texas, and then spent a couple years writing software in the industry. So I did some web design. I ended up doing mostly database work, data aggregation projects. So you'll see me bring up data examples as we go through the course. So I personally love numbers and love the really nerdy algorithm-y side of programming, but there are lots of different sides of it. And as you guys will see, especially today and tomorrow, design and the visuals plays a huge role into it as well. So yeah, that's a little bit about me. And I ended up leaving the industry because I wanted to work part-time to focus on some creative passions. And I also wanted to teach because I love teaching, and I really missed, I did some teaching on the side while I was working in the industry, but I found that that was some of my favorite stuff. So I'm really glad to be working at Lambda School and teaching you guys. So on that note, let's talk a little bit more about Lambda School. I know a lot of you guys are here because you're interested in attending Lambda School. Some of you guys may have already been accepted. Some of you guys may be very hesitantly thinking about joining, so I'll just give you the lowdown. So Lambda School is a 6-month immersive. So our goal is to take you guys basically from zero, from very little experience in the programming world, to the point where you are ready to be hired. And it's a really cool program. It's really unique because it seems that in all facets, it's been designed in a way that really focuses on making sure that everyone who can learn programming has the ability to. So I think that Lambda School does that in two different key ways. The first is that it is entirely online. So it's really awesome that it's entirely online, because in a lot of cases, it's hard to attend a good immersive unless you live in Austin or San Francisco or some other really expensive place. And now you can live anywhere and go to a computer programming immersive. That's really convenient for me because I live in Bisbee, Arizona, which you probably have never heard of, and I still get to teach at this awesome school and be connected to people all around the world. And so it's entirely online. And then the other piece that's, I think, even cooler than that is the tuition model. So when I went to my immersive, you basically had two choices. One was you pay a bunch of money up front. The other was you go find someone a private lender to loan you some money, so you can pay a bunch of money up front. And both are kind of scary options going in and not being sure what happens at the end. So Lambda School has totally flipped that upfront tuition model on its head. Instead, the way Lambda School is set up is if you don't want, you don't have to pay anything to attend. So you can pay zero, go through the entire course, and then only after you are hired do you start to pay back your tuition. So you have to be hired into a computer programming job before you even start paying your tuition back. So there's no risk on your part. If you, for whatever reason, do not get that job, then you don't have to pay your tuition. So that's another really cool thing, because that lowers the barrier cost for a lot of people. People can attend even if they don't have a giant chunk of change hanging around. So those are two really key parts about Lambda School I wanted to emphasize. It is 6 months, it's full-time. We do offer a part-time program that lasts a year as well. And you'll learn all sorts of cool web development related stuff in it. So I will be talking in every lecture from here on out. I'll dive a little deeper into something about Lambda School at the beginning of the lecture. You guys are welcome to ask some questions about it at the end. And you're also welcome to reach out to people in Slack. The person I always especially recommend reaching out to in Slack is Karen Zachary, and she is in charge of admissions. So she is going to be the person to ask all admissions related questions. And in fact, that actually reminds me, for your questions during this lecture, instead of putting them in the chat channel, make sure you actually ask a question. So there's a Q&A feature in Zoom. Make sure you utilize that, because I pay closer attention to that than I do to this, to the chat. And on that note, I see that Carrie has asked about if payments are suspended if you are in between jobs. Not to my knowledge, but that would actually be a much better question for Karen. That particular case hasn't come up in my experience. So I would talk to her and she can give you a more precise answer. So that's a little bit about Lambda School. All the skills that you're going to be learning in this course, in this introduction course, will be covered in the main curriculum in detail, as well as a lot of other things we won't even touch. So on that note, let me talk about the syllabus or a kind of overview of what we'll be exploring in this particular intro course. So over this week and next week. So the focus of this course is front-end web development. And that consists of 3 languages, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. We'll be talking a lot more about those in just a minute here. And yes, as I said at the beginning, the idea is to gain some technical skills to get a taste of what Lambda School is like. But as I said at the beginning, I think the most important goal of this intro course is to understand this idea of what does it mean to be a software engineer. So we will be coming back to that question again and again and taking the technical skills to try to understand them through that lens. So we'll just be introducing these 3 front-end languages in this course. And I will talk a lot more about what those are and what that means as we dive into the more technical component of tonight's lecture. One thing I just want to say from the get-go is that this intro course is designed for beginners. It's designed so that if you're starting at absolute zero in terms of programming experience, we'll try to explain everything from the ground up. However, I will say that it is fast-paced, and if you do have zero experience coming into this course, you might not be able to get everything done in real time over 2 weeks. So I talked to a lot of people in Slack, and it seems to me that most people who have zero coding experience coming into this sometimes have to go back and rewatch lectures or maybe even take it again. So I say that so that if you're brand new to coding, I don't want you to get discouraged if you're having some problems, because it's a lot to learn all at once. So stick with it, be patient with yourself, and you'll see yourself growing. If you have a little bit of exposure, or if you're coming from some other languages, I think you'll find the pacing of this course a lot more manageable. But either way, it's set up so that we're building you from the ground up. So while there will of course be questions and stumbling blocks, there shouldn't be any sort of core chunk of knowledge that is missing from this that would impede your advancement into the front-end web development world. So a couple other things. Slack is going to be huge. So Slack is the place to be when you have questions outside of class. So sometimes people reach out to me directly. I'm perfectly okay with that, but I cannot guarantee an immediate answer. So you're welcome to post questions in Slack. That's usually a better place to start, or you can always reach out to me directly. As far as the live lectures, each night will be set up the same way. So we'll start out with this lecture. So about an hour, sometimes it runs a little longer, and you guys can ask questions during the course of that, though I'll usually wait until the end of class to answer most of those. And then afterwards, will be a homework time. So it's a 3-hour block. About the first hour is the lecture, and then you will be assigned a project manager who will provide you with the homework. So the most common question I get after the first and second night is, where's the homework? Where's the homework? You will be assigned a project manager, and the homework link will be sent to you. So have a little bit of patience. It will come to you almost immediately after the lecture. So you'll have quite a bit of time to work on that, depending on how long the lecture was. And then at the end of the night, we have what's called a stand-up, where everyone comes together, or you come together in groups and discuss the homework. And I will say that I've talked to some students who kind of think that the stand-up is the least important part of the evening. But I think in some ways the stand-up is the most important part of the evening, because it's your time to come together and to actually get a sense for where everyone else is at. So I know I hyped the online thing quite a bit earlier, but I will say that the biggest downside of the online format is that you're so isolated from your fellow classmates that you don't really know where everyone's at. And it's easy to fall into this pit of feeling like you're the only one who's confused or everyone else is getting it. And so I think that the stand-up is really critical, because it lets you see that other people have questions. And furthermore, it lets you share some of your insights with them and get some of their insights back. So I urge you to stay for the stand-up at the end of class each night. And so that's really the format for this class. You'll be walked through it with the help of your project manager after we leave the lecture. Just make sure you're in the Zoom meeting by 5 o'clock Pacific, and everything should roll out from there. So that's a little overview of what we are going to be doing this week and next. It is an 8-part class, so we will be running this week, Monday to Thursday, and next week, Monday to Thursday. So those are all the basics for what we're doing here. And I will say also that tonight is going to be a little more housekeeping, obviously I've just taken 15 minutes to talk to you about what does Lambda look like, who am I, et cetera, and we'll be talking a lot more about ideas tonight and doing a little less coding. But I promise you that starting tomorrow throughout the rest of the course, we spend the vast majority of the class actually coding. So if you're really eager to get in there and write code, we'll do some of that tonight, but we also have a lot of groundwork to lay tonight. So tonight will be a little different. All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now. So I'll share my screen, and then we can take a look at the syllabus, and we can also start to talk about those 3 languages that we're going to be covering in this course: HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right. So I have the syllabus pulled up. I'm not sure if you guys, I think you guys should have received a link to this when you enrolled. If anyone is missing the link to this, just request that in Slack and someone, either a TA or myself, will send that to you. So this is just a little overview of everything we're going to be doing. We can see that tonight's mostly an introduction course. We'll be talking kind of about intro to everything. We'll also be diving into HTML and learning the basics of that. So the language we'll focus on tonight is HTML. Tomorrow, we're going to do more HTML and more CSS. And then starting Wednesday, we're going to talk about JavaScript for the rest of the course. So 6 whole nights are dedicated to JavaScript. That is definitely the predominant topic we will be discussing in this course. So if you're curious a little bit more about what we're going to learn each night, you're welcome to go into the syllabus and you can click on any of these for each of the nights and it will give you a breakdown of everything we're going to be discussing. Or if you want a little recap of what we talked about after the lecture, you can always go in and check the syllabus. So there's that for you. Wanted to make you aware of that. So now that I have showed you that, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about computer programming in general and specifically the language of HTML. So a lot of you guys, when I asked this idea of what do software engineers do, what does it mean to be a software engineer, a lot of you guys gave what I think is kind of the most direct answer, which is that software engineers solve problems using code. They have some sort of goal in mind and they bring it to life using code. So I'm going to start out with a simple example of something that a software engineer might do. So let me pull up a chunk of code for you guys. One second. Here we go. So let's say that a software engineer wanted to create a web page that just had one heading at the top and then a paragraph afterwards. So just create a web page. It has one heading and one paragraph. Well, to solve a problem like this, even though that's a pretty simple thing to do in the scheme of things, there's a lot that needs to be considered. And I will say from the get-go that this little chunk of code I have just pulled up on screen does exactly that. So we're going to be exploring a little bit about what that means. So first of all, when you're trying to solve a problem using code, there's a question of what language should you use. So all languages are a little different. Some are very different from each other. Some are a little more similar to each other. And some are better for solving different problems than others. As it were, HTML, or hypertext markup language, is a language that is designed to create web content. So if your problem that you're trying to solve involves building a web page, HTML would be a great place to start. So to clarify, HTML is what's called a markup language, which is different than a programming language. So markup languages are meant to display content, and we'll talk more about that distinction as we go along. So today and tomorrow we'll be exploring 2 markup languages, HTML and CSS. Moving forward, we'll be exploring a programming language, which is JavaScript. So now that we know that we want to use HTML to create our web page, we would have to actually write some HTML. And the most basic place to start with that is we need a text editor. So whenever you're writing code on your computer, you need somewhere to write it. Just like if you're writing an essay for school, you would need, Microsoft Word or Apple's Pages or some sort of piece of text editor to process that, a word processor. You need a text editor for code. And so there are a few different free text editors that we recommend. The one I have pulled up right here is called Sublime. A couple others are called Atom and VS Code. And those are just a few examples of text editors you might need. I will say right now that we have designed this class so you don't actually need a text editor for it. So why am I bringing this up if it's not something you even need for this intro course? Well, because it is a key staple of writing code. And we have set up this class so you don't need a text editor, but starting with the Lambda School main curriculum, and if you want to do any outside projects during this intro course, you will need a text editor. So you don't have to drop what you're doing and go download one if you don't want to, but be aware that most programming happens inside of a text editor, even though we'll kind of be taking a shortcut in this class, which I will get to later. So I have my text editor, Sublime Text, and now I need to put some code into it. So I need to know a thing or two about the language I'm working with. So I've figured out, okay, I am trying to create a web page, so I need HTML. I have a text editor open, which is going to be necessary for writing code in general. So what's the next step? Well, you have to know the rules of the language. Every language is a little different, but there are some common threads that apply to any language. One common thread is this idea of there being keywords. So every language has built-in words that are specific to the language that are meant to communicate something to the computer. So up here on the page, some of my keywords are HTML, body, H1P, and my text editor really conveniently highlights these in pink, so it's really easy to see. So these are specific trigger words or keywords that are built into the language of HTML so that I can give specific instructions on how I want to build my web page. So every language is going to have different keywords that do different things, and it's your job to know what those are and how to use them. On the note of how to use them, another really important piece whenever learning a new language is syntax. So syntax is kind of a grammar term, but it also applies to computer programming. It just means how do you construct your commands? Because everything you type out in a language is a command to the computer telling it to do something. So I need my keywords, but I also need to combine them together with certain symbols or pieces of punctuation, or else they won't work. And you might have noticed some patterns already in the code that I put up. We see that there are these little caret brackets, and they seem to be, whenever I have a keyword, it seems to be surrounded by these brackets. So we can already see a little hint into what some of the syntax rules in HTML might be. And we will talk about those in detail a little bit later when we actually dive in. But right now, I want to just give you guys the foundation of how to think about code in general. So when you're trying to solve a problem with code, you have to know what language you're going to use, and you also have to know how to write it, which means knowing keywords and syntactically how to construct commands to the computer. And once you know that, you can start writing out code and giving it instructions. So conveniently, I know some HTML, which is good because I'm the instructor. So I have constructed, using keywords and syntax, a little bit of HTML code that instructs the computer to render a web page with a header and a paragraph. So the very last step is we have to run our code. So right now I have some valid code up, but no web page. How do I get the code to execute so my web page appears? And the answer is going to be different depending on what language you're using and how you're using it. With HTML, it's pretty simple. So HTML is designed to be read by your browser. So whatever browser you use, Chrome, Firefox, Safari, Internet Explorer. I don't know why you're using Internet Explorer, but that's another conversation. Any browser is designed to open an HTML file. So if you've written out HTML code and saved it with a .html, you can open this in your browser, and it will appear not as code, but as a web page. So let's check it out. I'm going to go File, Open File. And then I need to, let's see, Lambda, course. We need to put this in a more convenient location. And then we'll do the p index, which is the file I showed you guys. So notice that instead of the code appearing on screen, the web page has appeared. And it's not a very exciting web page, to be fair, but it's, as I said, it has a header and it has a little paragraph on it. So by the end of tonight, you guys will know how to put together the syntactically correct HTML code to render something this simple and something even a little more complex than this on the page. So that's pretty cool. We just saw, yes, a simple example, but an example of how something went from code, a set of instructions, to the actual result, a web page. So there is a little example of some coding for you guys. Now, this example was, of course, HTML specific, but at the same time, a lot of what I said applies across the board. So when you're writing code, it really is just you're trying to solve some sort of problem. You're writing instructions to the computer to accomplish a task or solve a problem. So what are some of the problems we might solve? Well, building a website, that is a very pertinent one to this course since we're doing web development. You might also create an artificial intelligence chess player. You might store or retrieve data in a database. You might create a virtual reality computer game. All of these things are the kind of problems or tasks that you could use computer code to write a solution to. So in all of these problems, you would need either different languages or a different set of languages to solve. So there are many different languages. Some do really similar things. Some do totally different things. You couldn't write HTML code that would retrieve data from a database. It's just not designed to do that. Similarly, you couldn't use SQL, which is a database language, to create a web page. So some languages are very specific, and you need to know what languages are designed to do what. So we'll talk about that a lot just moving forward with the 3 languages we're covering in this course. So beyond different languages, once you know what language to use, as I mentioned with HTML, you have to know how to use it. And while the specific keywords or specific syntax will be different from language to language, the process is the same. You have to learn the rules so you can construct instructions that the computer understands how to read. And the syntax is so important. So once again, syntax is, what symbols do we use? What order do we put things in? How do our parentheses and brackets work? And we will be talking a ton about syntax just pretty much every single night as we learn how to do different things. And learning the syntax is probably the most challenging part at the beginning. So I'll be giving you hopefully lots of words of encouragement about some of the frustrations you can have when you're first learning a language about getting bogged down on where do the parentheses go. But once you have the syntax down, it's super fun because you become a wizard and you can do all these cool things just by typing things out on a screen. So beyond just writing the code, you always have to run the code too. As mentioned, that's going to be different from language to language. So we'll be talking about how to run each language we learn in this intro course, but moving forward in your programming career, every time you learn a new language or new skill, make sure you're asking yourself, how do I execute this? At what stage is this code actually read by the computer? It seems like a basic thing to ask, but I think that the ability to understand that really separates a sophisticated, competent programmer from someone who can kind of just throw stuff around until it hopefully mostly works. So my goal for you guys is to become the best programmers you can possibly be. So I'm going to be challenging you to, even from the get-go, think about these things in an advanced way. So there you go. That's a little breakdown of what computer programming is and how we think about it. So I'm just going to come back to this, this bit of code I have pulled up. Now you can see the actual thing it creates. And I'm just going to break it down in slightly more detail, just to give you guys a little bit of idea of what instructions I'm actually giving it. So the first line, I'm saying, hey, we're going to write an HTML document. These 2 lines both, I'm going to be a little hand wavy here, but they basically just set up the basics for having a document or, for having an HTML page. And then this line, line 4, is where I say, hey, I would like a header that says code example. Line 5 says, okay, now I would like a paragraph that says this is a paragraph on a web page. And then on line 6 and 7, I say, okay, I'm all done here. Let's close out and go on our merry way. So that is a very high level explanation of what's going on. And by the end of tonight, you'll have a much better idea of what's really going on there. But I wanted to bring you guys back to this idea of each piece of code on here, each line, though code can look a little bit like gibberish when you're looking at a new language for the first time, is an instruction to the computer, telling the computer to do something specific that will allow me to create this web page over here. All right, so now let's talk a little more about web development. So I've given you guys a lot of cool examples of things you might do with code, but we want to narrow our focus down specifically to building web pages and web apps, because that's what this intro course is all about, and that's what the Lambda School web development main curriculum is all about. So let's talk about web development for a minute. As you might have imagined, it really is, that term is just an umbrella term that refers to creating any sort of content on the web. So you guys are well familiar with content on the web, I'm sure, as a user, and your user experiences will help you with this. But in the spirit of thinking like a software engineer, and in this case specifically thinking like a web developer, we're going to try to shift you from thinking about how you as a user experience it to thinking about what's going on behind the scenes. And I will say that I think that that's a really key point in this question I posed at the beginning of what is a software engineer. Software engineer is someone who doesn't just ask what something is or what it does, but they're always asking how it works, how it accomplishes what it does. So now your job is to, whenever you're on the web, be asking yourself, how does this web page do this? What's going on behind the scenes? So I'll give you a few tools to start to ask that tonight. So when talking about web development, and I'm going to go over here and pop up Lambda School's web page as a little example for us. There are two components to web development, front-end web development and back-end web development. So they are both covered in detail in the main curriculum of Lambda School, but we will be focusing in this intro course mostly on front-end development. But I want to introduce you to both terms so that you understand what I mean when I say those, or what someone else means when they say those. So front-end web development is going to feel a little more familiar to you as a web user, because it deals with all the things that a web user can see. So front-end web development is all about, what do you see? What's the text on the screen? What are the images? How is it interactive? What pops up when you hover over things? That's front-end web development. Back-end web development is the stuff that you don't see, but is equally important. So there's not too much back-end stuff going on in the Lambda School webpage, but let's think about social media. When you go on your Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook account, all of a sudden a bunch of things are rendered, and they're conveniently all posts by people that you follow or by your friends, and they're somehow displayed in the order of most recent or most relevant, depending on what you're looking at. So how does that happen? Somewhere out in the ether, I've been told that most of the data exists in the Midwest, so maybe not out in the ether. Maybe somewhere out in the Midwest somewhere is a warehouse with a bunch of servers in it and a bunch of stuff stored. How does the right stuff appear on your page? And how is it when you post something on your own social media account that it appears and it is transported to your friends? Well, there's a whole world of web development going on behind the scenes called back-end web development that makes all that stuff possible. So back-end web development deals with data. It's all about storing and retrieving data from databases and sending it back to or receiving it from your computer. So when you post something, the backend would handle receiving that and putting it in the database. And then when you load your feed, the backend would deal with retrieving the right items and sending them back to the front end so they can be displayed. So unfortunately, we will not be going into any sort of dirty detail on the back-end side of things, on the data side of things. As mentioned, I personally am a big fan of back-end web development. I think it's really fun, but we need to lay some foundation before you can get there. So once you go through Lambda School's main curriculum, you will be a data master. But unfortunately, we won't really talk about that. We won't talk about the technical side of that in this course. We will be focusing more on front-end web development. So let's talk about the languages that make this all up. Well, really, the key languages you need are the three languages we're going to learn. So HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So let me talk about what the three of those languages do. And in fact, I'm going to pull up a little code base that has examples of each of those. So let me find my code base. All right, so before we look at this code base, let's pause for a second so I can answer a question perhaps some of you are already asking, which is, what is a code base? Well, a code base is a collection of files that all come together to accomplish some task. So if you are creating an AI chess player, you might have a boatload of files that do different things, but when you pull them all together, you have your chess player. Similarly, in web development, whenever you have a website or a web app, you will have a bunch of different files that do a bunch of different things, maybe in different languages. And the culmination of all of them together creates your project. So most of the time on the job is spent looking at a code base. Code bases can have thousands of files in them. This one has 3, which is a nice starting place. So this code base here is a code base that all builds up to a slightly more sophisticated web page. So we see that there is an HTML file here, and we already learned how to open an HTML file. So let's go ahead and open this up so we can see what this code base looks like. And then we can talk about what role all 3 of these are playing in it. So I'm going to pull it up over here. Here's my index.html. So I'm just opening it in the browser, and we can see our web page. So this web page I've just pulled up is the web page that corresponds to this code base. Oops, not that code base. Let me find my code base. Here we go. So these 3 files equal this page. Let me actually do some moving around on my screen so we can look at both of them at the same time. Beautiful. Okay. There we go. So let's talk about this. So HTML, we'll start there because you guys already have a pretty good idea of what HTML does. I said that HTML is what we use to create web pages, but let me get a little more specific. HTML is the language that we use to put content on the page. And so what do I mean by content? Well, I mean text, buttons, links, images, things like that. So for example, the words web page put up use HTML. This paragraph, also HTML. This button was also created using HTML. And even the box that all these things are contained in is HTML. If we look over at Lambda School, we could also see some more examples. This text, this button, even the links on this nav, or the text on this nav bar. Excuse me, all of those are HTML. So over here in our code base, we see some instructions about what contents to put on the page. So that is HTML for you. The next piece of the puzzle is CSS, which stands for Cascading Style Sheet. So we will be talking a lot more about CSS tomorrow, but I want to introduce it to you today. So CSS styles the page. So while HTML says what goes on the page, CSS will tell the computer how it should look. So notice that this web page has a blue background. The box has a border. Notice that the header here has kind of a scripty font. That's all styling. So that is all CSS. If we went over to Lambda School's page, we can see that this is the color red. We can also see on either of these that there's some space between our text and the edge of the screen. Space between text and the edge of the screen. Also CSS. Notice in that first example I gave you, everything was pushed to the side. And when you think about your like ancient late 90s websites, there wasn't much CSS going on then. So now CSS is huge because really user-friendly, aesthetically pleasing websites are the modern standard. So CSS plays a really important role. So these 2 languages, which are both markup languages, are all about what is rendered on screen. So what does JavaScript do? Well, JavaScript is kind of the hidden warrior of web development. It's the least obvious thing as a user, but it's the thing you spend the most amount of time with as a developer. So JavaScript is like the electricity. It makes everything run. It makes your pages dynamic. So what do I mean by dynamic? Well, when I click this button, ta-da, some words appeared. That's dynamic. It looked one way, and then it changed. So if you go over to the Lambda school, notice that the color of the button actually changes slightly when I hover. That's JavaScript. So front-end JavaScript is all about changing the style, changing what appears on screen. It's also, you know, when you submit a form or submit a post, that's all JavaScript. And then all of that back-end stuff I mentioned, all that database stuff going on behind the scenes is handled mostly by JavaScript. So JavaScript, even though from just a, you know, surface perspective, doesn't play as obvious of a role as HTML or CSS, it's pretty critical. So we can see over here 3 different files all coming together. Sorry, gonna delete that. 3 different files coming together to create a web page. And we'll be talking a lot more about the other 2 languages when we actually get to them tomorrow and Wednesday. But I do just want to direct your attention right now to the fact that syntactically you can tell that these 3 languages look a little different. So I just mean that visually, all 3 languages look a little different. And by the time we're done with these 2 weeks, you'll understand exactly why and what rules apply to each language that make them appear different in my code base. So there is a little introduction to the 3 languages that we're going to be using throughout this course. So now you guys have a basic idea of what each does. And as we go through and learn the details on them, you'll be able to put them into action. So the last thing I wanted to talk to you guys about before we really dive into talking about how to write some HTML code before we get into the details of HTML is what I think is a really relevant question, which is now that you have some context of what goes on behind the scenes for a web developer, what does it really look like to work a software engineering job? I think that in terms of asking that question I posed at the beginning, what is a software engineer? And in terms of asking yourselves, is this something that's right for me? That's a critical question. So I'm going to use some of the stuff that we've explored already to talk about what that looks like from my experience and my tangential experience through friends and colleagues. So as I mentioned, code bases are huge. You'll spend a lot of time with a code base in front of you. But it's not all about writing code. One of the biggest skills of a software engineer is understanding code. So a lot of the times you'll be presented with a huge chunk of code, you know, thousands of files that have maybe been in existence since like the 90s. And it's your job to understand them. Sometimes you'll be asked to work on a project that's in a language you've never even learned before. And the only thing more intimidating than a giant code base is a giant code base written in an unfamiliar language. It's really not uncommon to be asked to learn a new language or a new tool on the job. So, so while of course the languages we learn are useful, it's also really important to just think in terms of how do you learn something you don't know. So a huge part of your job as a software engineer involves looking at unfamiliar things and staying calm in the face of the great unknown and playing around until it starts to make sense. Fortunately, there's tons of online resources. So maybe the majority of your time as a software engineer is going to be spent Googling things. I'm not joking about that. I am dead serious. After every day of work, you will have like 55 tabs open on your computer that you just have to click close one at a time and be like, whoa, what happened to me today? So in the spirit of that, I want you guys to be Googling in this class. Every time you get stuck, I want the first thing you do to be Google it. And I will say that sometimes I actually had one experience where I Googled something and there was an example of the homework for this class with the answers in it posted. If you find that, maybe don't look at it because you won't learn. But beyond that, use tutorials, find other videos, find blog posts, find documentation. There's tons of online resources, and it is not cheating to use those. That is the most important skill. Like if I could shake you guys by the shoulders, I would do that right now to say that is the most important skill you could possibly learn, is how to find the answer to a problem you don't know using the internet. Like I cannot emphasize enough how important that is. So that is what I want to share with you guys about being a software engineer. Beyond coding, writing code and Googling things and trying to understand cryptic code bases, you know, there are other normal job things like meetings and planning and this and that. But most of your time is probably going to be spent trying to figure out what in the world's going on via either playing around with the code base or Googling things or trying things out. So in the spirit of that, I want you guys to move forward with this idea of that you shouldn't just have the answer from the get-go, that it's more important to kind of flail around a little bit and struggle. And sometimes the most simple answer to a homework question is something I didn't even teach in the lecture. And sometimes that's on accident, but most of the time that's on purpose because I want you guys Googling. Seriously, Google. Search things in Google. All right, I'm done on that point for now. I'll bring it up again a million more times until you're sick of hearing it, but I'm doing it because I care. All right, so that is all of the groundwork. I know we're now at 45 minutes, so there's a lot of groundwork. I promise you, every other night from here on out, we will start coding a lot sooner than this. But now we are ready to jump in and do a little bit more take a little bit more detailed look at HTML so that you guys are ready to write some HTML for the homework tonight. So I am going to pull up another example for you guys. All right. And let me pull up this as well. Okay, so up here I have another web page, and you guys by now can probably tell that this web page that I have up here is HTML without CSS. Remember, CSS is styling. So we can see that there's not really any style on here. Everything is all squished over to one side. There's no color. You may notice that there's some slight size differences in the text. That's because HTML has a few auto styles. I'll talk about that a little more in a minute. But by and large, this thing looks like a website you would have visited back in like 1997. So this is just HTML with no style on it. So let's talk about what's going on here. HTML, to understand HTML, the key thing you have to understand is the idea of an element. What is an element? So think of elements as these blocks that we use to build our web pages. So if you thought about having a bunch of different sizes and shapes of cardboard boxes, and you take the biggest cardboard box and you nest smaller boxes in it, and then sometimes put even smaller boxes in those boxes, and you use those to arrange your web page. So everything's kind of nested together. And that is the key thing to understand about HTML, is that you're building you're taking these elements, these building blocks, and you're creating them, and then you're nesting them appropriately. So I've created a very colorful diagram to kind of emphasize this point. So the biggest block, the core building block for any HTML web page is called the HTML element. So every HTML element, or every HTML page starts with an HTML element. And it's kind of abstract, and it's basically invisible. And think of it as just the container that you put everything else in. And for the purposes of this course, you won't really have to work much with the HTML element. So I'm mentioning it now, but you don't really have to understand it yet. So at the highest level is the HTML element, and that's the container that everything goes in. Inside of that is the body. So the body is kind of similar in that it's sort of a starting place, but the body is less abstract. So for example, if we go over to this web page, we see that there's some stuff going on, but there's a boatload of white space just kind of out here. So all of that white space would be the body. It's just kind of the blank canvas that we start on. So all of that white space and stuff that doesn't really have anything on it, you could think of as the body. So now we start building some more interesting things. So in this diagram, the next container I've created, the next element, is called the H1. That's a header element. And we can see header 1 up here. So we see that at the top we have a header element. Inside that we have something called a div, which is kind of just another container. And within our div we have a paragraph. We can see that paragraph on screen as well. Beneath that we have a div that contains 2 items, another header and another paragraph. So it turns out that these 2 things are actually grouped together. So this is kind of hanging out on its own. This is hanging out on its own. These are grouped together. And just as a web user, there's no way we could have told that. But by looking at the diagram or at the code, which we'll look at in a minute, you can tell that these last two elements are actually grouped together. So an important takeaway of this is that some elements are really obvious and visible. Things that have text, you know, things like headers and paragraphs. Of course, things like images and buttons, also pretty obvious. But some HTML elements are invisible. Things like divs or the body. They're just used for grouping or containing other things. And we'll explore that in a lot more detail as we dive more into the code. To see what that looks like in an analog, that's not, darn, I think I accidentally closed out the thing I wanted to show you. 1 second. Sorry, 1 second. Here we go. Okay. Here's the code that corresponds to this. So let me kind of stagger everything so you can see all three at once. Hopefully that's not too much of a stimulus overload. So here's the actual web page, here's a diagram, and then here's the code. So after a little bit of practice, when you see this code, it'll basically look in your head like this diagram. And we can see that there are kind of analogs here. We have our body, a header at the top, we have a paragraph tucked inside of a div, and then two more elements all grouped together inside of our div. So I know I'm kind of throwing out terms all over the place. We're about to dive in and do some coding ourselves, but here's just a little framework for how to think about this. So as we're going more and more into this HTML, just think about everything in terms of elements, these nested containers that are all grouped together in different ways to build a web page. So let's go ahead and jump into our sandbox environment. So I mentioned that we would not be needing a text editor for this class. That's because we are going to be using sandbox environments. In the case of tonight and tomorrow, we're using something called CodePen. You guys should have already created a CodePen. If you haven't for some reason, you will need to before the homework tonight. So CodePen and other sandbox environments are online tools that are created for when you want to play around with small chunks of code. So the main use cases for something like CodePen would be either as a learning tool when you're first learning, or if you want to just experiment with something kind of simple, you can throw it in. So for example, debugging. If I have a bigger code base and something's not working the way I think, I might pull a piece of it into a sandbox environment just to play around with it. And they're really great because they give you instant feedback. So remember, with a normal HTML file, you have to write it out, save it, open it in your browser, search through all your files to try and find it, and then you can see what happens. And every time you change something, you have to click refresh. That's a pain in the butt. Sandbox environment does all the hard work for you. So you can just start creating elements right away, and they will appear immediately. So over here is going to be where you write your code, and then over here is going to be where your web page appears, and it will update live. Every time you change something, it will update in real time. So really convenient tool, especially at the beginning. So all your homework and all of my lectures are going to be done in sandbox environments. And like I did tonight, I'll mention what the actual code-based text editor version would look like, but we're really going to be focusing on sandbox environments so you can get the syntax down and not worry about the other stuff. So running your code just became a lot easier. Okay, so now that we've done that, let's talk about these elements that I've kind of vaguely introduced you to already. So headers. So headers, as you might imagine, are used to create headers. So anytime you want either a heading for your entire web page or a subheading for a subsection, you would use a header element. There are 6 of these, H1 through H6. So let's talk about how to build a header element using code. You start out with something that's called the opening tag. So you need a bracket followed by the name of the element, H1, and that has to be precise. That's one of those things that's built into the language. So you can't type out header 1. Notice that things got kind of wacky. So you actually need H1. So make sure that you know the actual names of all the elements. Fortunately, they are all easily Googleable if you need them. And we'll do a little demo of that in a minute. So H1. So you do an opening tag. You need 2 of these caret brackets inside the tag name. And then you put whatever goes inside of the element. So in the case of a header, it's probably just going to be text. So then you can write out your text as you see fit. Your header can say anything. And then you have to close your element. So you have to write a piece of code that tells the computer, I'm opening an element and I'm closing one. So the closing tag looks extremely similar to the opening tag. The only difference is there's this little backslash in there. And that has to go in between the brackets and the tag name. So syntax, this is the syntax thing I was talking about. It's very important that you use the right kind of brackets and that you put the backslash in the right place and that you use the correct names of your elements. Precision is really important. This isn't like writing a text to your mom where if you misspell something, she'll know what you mean. You have to spell all the keywords correctly. You have to use exact syntax or things will go wrong. So that's probably going to be the most time and energy that you spend in this course, is just into making sure all the little pieces are in the right spot. So there you go, your first HTML element. Let's add a few more. So I mentioned that there were a couple other headers. I'll just do, and there are 6. I'm just going to throw a couple of these up here. So notice that by default, these are appearing in a different size on your screen. So there's a little exception to the rule about CSS providing styling. Some HTML elements have some default styles built in. Most of the time in the real world, you just override all that and write everything customized. But you'll see that there are some different things, different auto formats and styles that appear without writing any CSS. One of those is the fact that H1 is the biggest header and so forth and so forth. I will say that when you're using headers, don't think in terms of size because you can change size. Think in terms of importance. So use H1 if you want a really important header, the header for your whole website, your business name, your name, whatever. Use something like an H3 if it's an important section. Use something like H5 if it's just a little header that kind of doesn't matter. For example, when you Google search something, your search will be matched more to things like H1s. So this does actually matter. So think about an H1 as being your most important header, H2 is the next most important, etc. And for right now, it's okay if you kind of think about it in terms of size, but it's not a good habit to have. So there is your first example of some HTML elements. Let me introduce you to paragraphs. These ones are pretty simple. Notice I created my opening and my closing tags to create my elements. And the tag name for a paragraph is going to be P, just P, not paragraph, just P. And right now I've created it, but there's nothing on screen because I have to populate it. And in a paragraph, the most common thing we're going to have is text. So I put that text and it has appeared as a paragraph. So now we have a paragraph on screen. So the next 2 elements I want to show you are a little different. The next one I'm going to introduce you to is called the div. The div is the most used HTML element, I think, by a long shot. It's kind of weird at the beginning, but it's really critical. And you saw it already in that little example I gave you before. Divs are all about grouping things together. So for example, if this header went with this paragraph, if that header were designed to head the paragraph, we might want to group them together inside of a div. So a couple important things to note here. First of all, as you've already seen with the other elements I've introduced you to, we have our opening tag and we have our closing tag. Oh, and by the way, divs stand for division element, just so you know. People call them divs usually. So we have our opening and our closing. So now a couple new things. First of all, notice that instead of putting text inside of a div, I actually put new HTML elements inside. So sometimes HTML elements contain text, sometimes they contain other HTML elements. I hate saying HTML elements. It's horrible to have to say it 80 times, but that's just me griping. Anyways, so we put these inside of the div to say that these things are nested. So once again, think about this cardboard box idea. You have a large cardboard box and you've put two smaller cardboard boxes tucked inside of it next to each other. Another thing I've done that's new is I've indented this. So that brings me to the topic of white space. So in most programming languages, things like new lines, spaces, tabs don't actually matter to the computer. The computer would read it just fine if it were all on one giant line. But your future self and your fellow developers can't read it if it's on one giant line. So that's why we use tabbing in white space. And this is super important. It's easy to neglect this at the beginning, but get in good habits. So whenever you have elements nested inside of another element, you always want to tab them over. That makes it really easy for you and your fellow developers to read your code. So get in the habit of using tabbing when you have things nested inside of other things. So now this header and this chunk of text are all grouped together, but the div by default is invisible. So how do we know they're grouped together? Well, we can tell by looking at the code, and if we want to tell for sure, I'm going to do a little bit of magic over here. Pay no attention to the CSS behind the curtain. We can throw some style on, and all of a sudden now the div just went from invisible to having a border around it. So we can see that even though it was invisible before, it was actually there. And now we've thrown a little styling on to make it a little more obvious. So divs are containers that are used to group like items together. They're really important for positioning things together or styling things together. They become a little more clear on why they matter when we get into the CSS. But for now, just think of them as a way to clump items together. The last element I want to introduce you to is also an invisible one. Let's say that we wanted to highlight some important words. So if I had another paragraph down here, and I said, we are going to learn HTML and CSS. Maybe I wanted to somehow emphasize the two names of the languages. So that's when we would use something called a span element. So span elements are kind of like divs in that they're by default invisible and they're containers, but they're more designed for either a single word or a phrase or some sort of piece of text in a paragraph or somewhere else that we want to highlight or differentiate in some way. So divs are more like big containers to put like items in. Spans are more like a way to emphasize a certain word. And once again, spans are going to be invisible by default, but let me do a little bit of CSS magic. No, oops, can't spell. Sorry. Just struggling to write some simple code over here. All right, there we go. So I just added a little background color to those. And don't worry about the CSS stuff. It will all make sense come tomorrow. I just want to add this in to show you guys your spans so you can actually see them. So notice that now, even though this is a whole paragraph, we were able to add a pink background to just two of the words because we encapsulated them in spans. And as with spans, the syntax is going to be exactly the same. We start with an opening tag and then a closing tag. And inside of those, we have the words that we want encapsulated in the spans. So there you go. I've introduced you to basically four elements, actually more because there are 6 headers, but you've been introduced to the header used for headers, the paragraph used for paragraphs, the div used for grouping like items together, and finally the span, which is used for highlighting words or chunks of text inside of something like a paragraph. So those are the 4 starting points for you guys. You'll be using all 4 of those in the homework tonight to write and read some of your own HTML code. And then we'll build upon that tomorrow, and I'll teach you guys a few more slightly more interesting elements, things like images and links and lists. All right, so just a couple more things I'm going to show you guys before we wrap up tonight. It's a little bit of a longer lesson tonight too. I appreciate your patience. I know you're very eager to get coding and start practicing all this. The last thing I want to show you is that now that you have these skills, you get to use the internet not only like an internet user, but like an engineer. So all of a sudden, every time you go to a website, I want you guys to be thinking a little differently, thinking about what's on the page. So you can make some guesses about what's on the page. For example, you might guess, oh, this is probably a header element, but you don't have to guess. It turns out that there is a way for you to take a peek. So every browser, it's a little different depending on what browser you use, but every browser has this tool. So you can click and say inspect. And bam. There's something called the Elements tab that pops up, and this will give you a little look into what's going on behind the scenes. And we can see now the actual code over here. And I do apologize, I know it's a little small on the screen, but we can see that actually that's an H1 and this is an H1. They're 2 different elements, and they're both inside of a div. So there you go, 3 examples of things you just learned. It turns out those are in something called a section, which you have not learned yet. But those are inside a div, inside of a div, and there's another div. Didn't I tell you there'd be lots of divs? There are lots of divs. So this is a skill you will have to practice on the homework tonight. And remember, you just right-click, hit inspect. This thing pops up, and you can, as you put your mouse or your cursor over different elements, we can see that's an H3. You can play around and explore and see what's really going on behind the scenes. You can use these little drop-down carrots to see how things are nested. And you also can get a little taste of how convoluted websites actually are. This will also give you a chance to practice something that I think is really important, which is that feeling of, oh my, this is really complicated and I'm overwhelmed. It turns out that that's really important. So I'm now going to come back to finally to this original question I asked of what is a software engineer? Well, you guys are totally right that a software engineer is someone who writes code to solve problems. But I think on the more fundamental level, a software engineer is someone who can stay calm in the face of the unknown. It's someone who knows how to bring themselves from a space of being overwhelmed and not knowing what's going on to a space of this is starting to make sense, to a space of, oh, I get it. And the way you do that is, of course, with tons of Googling. It's also done with like kindness to yourself. And maybe that seems a little cheesy, but it's totally true. The like most important skill you could learn in this, I think in Lambda school, period, is the ability to not understand what's going on, and instead of being like, oh my God, I'm such an idiot, to be like, oh, this is really hard and complex, and I'm going to play around with it and gain some knowledge. And that to me is the biggest difference between people who are software engineers and succeed in software engineering and people who can't cut it. So that is, I want you to practice all the technical skills, of course, but I want you to be practicing this throughout this course, this being kind and patient with yourself when you don't get it, because I promise you, every single one of you will have multiple head banging against the wall moments as you go through this. It's just a part of the process. You got to learn to love it. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the homework for tonight, as well as remind you guys of the general format here. So once again, we will have a lecture every night that's about an hour long, sometimes a little more, maybe sometimes a little less, but usually a little more. Sorry, guys. We'll have a lecture. I'll do a Q&A at the end. Then you will be assigned a PM, a project manager, who will provide you with your homework. You will have a chunk of time to work on that, an hour to an hour and a half. And then at the end, you'll all get together in a group to discuss. And I really urge you to stick around for that. I think it's extremely valuable. So I hope you guys will stick around for that. So on that note, let me show you the homework for tonight. The homework will be in CodePen for tonight and tomorrow. So you have 3 exercises. The first 2 are a little more answering questions, playing around. So exercise 1 right here, you'll go through and there are just questions, and I want you to reflect on these and write out the answers. This is really important. I promise you, this isn't busy work. These are the questions you need to ask yourself before you make a commitment like Lambda School. Or even if you're not going through Lambda School, before you put the time into this, like, you need to think about these things. So some of these are more about personal growth. Some of these are actually about this idea of thinking about the web from the perspective of a user. Exercise 2 is all about that. So you'll have to use that inspect tool I just showed you to accomplish exercise 2. And there are a bunch of questions you'll have to answer about some websites. And then exercise 3, you will get a chance to code. So when you're done, you can drag this down or over. We've provided you with a little bit of starting code here. You're going to be building a basic website, About Me website. So you can use this code if you want. You can scrap it and start from scratch, whatever you want to do. You just have to follow the specifications up here. We have written some CSS. Don't mess with that. I mean, if you're really bored at the end, you can, but it will make life easier if you leave it alone. It will help you see what is going on better. So ignore the CSS. And that's the homework for tonight. You will not have to submit it. Okay, actually, you will have to fork it. So you'll go to Lambda Schools, you'll go to the link, and you'll have to press this fork button here. That will create a copy on your own CodePen site. So once you have your own copy using the fork, really important to fork, you can start editing and saving it. So yeah, you'll just be able to save it. So once you fork it, it's now created a copy of it under my name. Now I can edit and save it. There's no need to submit, just save. Because we have a copy of your CodePen name, we'll have access to it. All you have to do is save it. So that is the homework for tonight. In some ways simple, in some ways quite complicated. So before I set you guys free to work on that, I will try to get to as many of the questions as I can in Slack. And I see that, or sorry, not in Slack, in Zoom. I see that there are a ton tonight, so I might not get to them all. So I will try to answer as many as I can. Let me go ahead and jump in. Okay, we have a question about how does this environment differ from the actual classes? I think what William is asking is, how does the setup for the intro course compare to the main curriculum? So I think that's a great question. And so, and the answer is that we try to keep those as similar as possible. We've designed this course to give you both conceptually a taste of Lambda School, but also logistically. So things happen in Zoom. All of our lectures happen in Zoom. We do a lot of pairing up and group work in Zoom. One of the biggest differences is going to be that we're using sandbox environments in this class. So you'll be mostly writing things in actual text editors and working with code bases or more advanced things in the course. You'll also be using a tool called Git. So there's a tool called Git, which is a really big part of what web developers do. And it's this way of, it's a command line tool. So you type a little command on your computer and it will like pull code from the internet, and then you can change it, and then it will like compare it to what someone else has written. It's really awesome. We used to have it in the intro course, but it's not the best thing to learn at the very beginning. So that is one of the biggest ways that they differentiate, is that you will be using a lot of Git. The other thing is that we'll go into a lot more detail in the Lambda course. It's also going to be a full day long, so it's a little more dynamic in terms of, you know, you might have a lecture and then homework time, and then you come back together to talk about it as a group in a little more of a formal way than in this class. But we do try to parallel it as best as we can. Let's see, we have, someone said that they already started this as self-paced and is wondering if they can use the work they've already done. Absolutely. If you're going through this a second time, or if you've gone through half of this, you know, I would encourage you to go through the exercises again, honestly, just to drive the point home. But if you're just here to kind of try and relearn one piece, you know, don't sweat it too much. So, you know, I will actually say I encourage you to do the homework a second time. It's not the end of the world if you don't, but that would be my recommendation. Similar question, can we submit a website we've already made? No, I would ask you to just stick to the requirements of the homework. If you have some experience, some of the homework might seem a little simple. Feel free to experiment around, but just finish it quickly and then you can go do whatever you want. As far as homework access goes, yeah, so this is the most commonly asked question. You will be assigned a project manager, that's someone on our Lambda team who will send you the link to the homework after this course. So it will come to you. We have a question about what are the chances of actually getting into a Lambda School class? That would be a great question for Karen Zachary in admissions. So any admissions related questions, I would reach out directly to her in Slack and she can tell you whatever you need to know. We have a request to see how to inspect a website again. I'll go to my little example here. So you can either just click anywhere or highlight a specific element and right click and inspect. And it might say inspect element or something slightly different depending on the browser you're using, but it should include the word inspect. And then a sidebar will pop up over here. Let's see what other questions we have. A question about Git. Yeah, Git is G-I-T, if anyone wants to Google it. Another reminder about the homework is that you will receive the homework and you don't have to formally submit it. You just have to fork it on CodePen and save it. That's it. There's no submit. Oh, actually, here's a really good question. I meant to talk about this earlier, so I'm glad someone brought it up. There is something related to admissions that I wanted to talk to you about. So when you are ready to actually start the admissions process for the Lambda School main curriculum, there is something called the Lambda Challenge. The Lambda Challenge is a JavaScript-based challenge that you have to complete to start admissions. So everything on the challenge will be covered in this course. So if you are new to programming, I would wait until you're finished with this course and feeling comfortable with all the homework before you start that. If you have some previous experience with JavaScript or programming and you feel ready to start that now, feel free to take that as soon as you're ready. So if you feel like you're ready to take that challenge, or if you're curious to know more about it, reach out to Karen Zachary in Slack. Question about assuring that your CodePen is linked to Lambda. That should have been taken care of when you signed up for this course. So you should be good to go on that. Man, I'm getting a ton of questions here. So I'm going to try and scroll up to the top and get some of the earlier ones. Okay, access to these lectures. So I'm recording this lecture and I will upload it to YouTube. Unfortunately, there is a little bit of a delay in the time it takes to render it and upload it, so it's not going to be available right away. So you can try and find some of the old lectures if there's something you want to see while you're working on the homework, but it will be available by tomorrow. Let's see. We have a kind of random question about Mac versus Windows. Generally speaking, life is a lot easier as a developer if you have a Mac. Things are just easier to set up and install in Mac. However, you can code from either, and for the purposes of this intro course, it will not matter. We have a question about design. So as far as design goes, this course just is not oriented towards design. You'll have a chance, especially tomorrow with CSS, to play around with some design elements, But the main focus of this course is programming, and we focus a lot of the nights on JavaScript. So if you're most interested in the design part of web development, Lambda School might not be the best fit, because while we do talk a lot about user experience and design and get a lot deeper into CSS and website design, that's just one piece of the puzzle. And so generally speaking, a designer is going to not really have back-end knowledge and really focus especially on things like CSS and HTML. We do a ton of other stuff. So if you're really not interested in the programming side, Lambda School might not be the best fit. However, I would urge you to stick with this course, and maybe you actually have a knack for programming that you never knew you had. So that's a little answer to that. All right, I'm getting a million questions. So I think I'm going to, first of all, I really appreciate how many questions you guys are answering. I can tell you guys are really paying attention, and that makes me feel like I'm doing my job well. Second of all, I want to make sure you have a lot of time for the homework tonight. So I am going to cut you off. I'm sorry. I want to make sure you have time for the homework, but feel free to Google your question. Yes, Google your question, or ask it in Slack, or if, in one of the general channels, or you can always send me a message if it's something that you think I personally might be able to answer better. So yeah, so I'm gonna cut you loose. Keep asking questions in Slack and in your stand-up tonight. That's another great place to discuss things. But that is going to be it for tonight, so you guys have time for your homework. All right, thank you so much for hanging out with me tonight on our first lesson of Intro to Web Development. Tomorrow night, we will be diving deeper into HTML and learning a lot about CSS. It will be a much more coding-intensive class. So I will see you guys tomorrow, and good luck with the homework. Have a great night.